Hello. The Games Workshop Design Studio has been home to many legends over the years. Writers, designers, and artists who have built and shaped the very hobby that we love from the ground up. My guest today is one such individual who joined Games Workshop back when it was based in London and was mostly just selling the RPGs created by other companies. He has channeled his love for games of all kinds into phenomenally creative expressions of gameplay. From Blood Bowl to Adeptus Titanicus, from Advanced Heroquest to Epic 40,000. And over the course of a 40-year career at Games Workshop, he was involved in some capacity in pretty much every single major release that there has been. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with the one and only Jervis Johnson. Jervis, thank you for joining me. I wondered if we could start with just where you actually got your start in miniature gaming. How did you get into it as a hobby?
Okay, well, I started out with a lot of, in the same way as a lot of my peers, basically. Like, I'm sure it's the same for Rick and Hal and everybody. Basically, I picked up a box of Airfix toy soldiers from a toy shop. I would have been about 10, I would have thought. And found the books of US Marines, Airfix US Marines, which I can still remember fondly to this day, and took them home and broke them off their little sprues that they came with, and basically set them up and moved things around, and kind of made games up. Though it was pretty much, I think, rolling things at them or throwing things at them to knock them over at the time. Right. But very soon after that, I came across a book called Battle Practical Wargaming by Charles Grant Senior, not Charles Grant Jr. You have to be careful about mixing the two up. Which was absolutely seminal for me. It's a fantastic book. I love it to this day, basically, and I love Charles Grant's writing. He's a fantastic wargamer from the 1960s and 70s. And that introduced me to World War II wargaming, and I kind of basically went on from there.
Right. And then you ended up working at Games Workshop in London. How did that come about?
Well, I started out working at a shop called Game Centre, which was in a little street called Hanway Street, just off Oxford Street in central London. And it was my local game store. I used to cycle from my home, rather perilously, I have to say, into central London to go to Game Centre. And I bought my games there. And they had a club that met next door, and I played mainly role-playing games in the club, basically. And they published a magazine called Games and Puzzles magazine. And they had a little advert in it when I was doing my A-level saying we're looking for staff. So I thought, well, it's my mum actually said, you should have a go, just give it a try. And I bring this story up occasionally when I'm talking to people, because I think there are things in your life sometimes when you say I could have gone left or I could have gone right, and it changes your life. And seeing that little tiny small lad, and then my mum saying, "Why don't you go for it?" and then getting the job is why I'm sitting here talking to you now. Basically, it wouldn't have happened without that. But I got a job at Game Centre, which seemed like heaven to me. And when I was there, I met in Livingstone. Steve Jackson used to come around. Basically, they drop off, hand deliver things, like Dungeons and Dragons and stuff. And then the guy who ran the store when I was there was a chap with a magnificent name of Peter Darvel Evans. He's a wonderful, lovely man. He went to work at Games Workshop, and I was at a games day just a few years later, and he said, I'm looking for an assistant. Would you be interested in joining me at Games Workshop? So I said, okay. And I went along for an interview, got the job, and started out in trade sales at Games Workshop on Sunbeam Road in London, way back in the day. So it's like 1984, something like that. And kind of went on from there.
Right, great. And you were still playing lots of games at that time as well?
I have always played a lot of games. I've never stopped, really. I've got when it comes to games, I've got Catholic, like a Catholic taste with a small c. I love all sorts of games. So I love board games, miniatures games, role-playing games, classic games. I play cribbage almost every day and backgammon and stuff like that with my wife. And there's a little club that meets near here, and I play miniatures games and stuff like that. So with the Perrys and stuff. So and I've always done that. I've always played games. And throughout my career at Games Workshop, I did too.
Well, that's great. Yeah. And then from that time when you first started, so you're in trade sales, it was still Steve Jackson, Ian Livingston running Games Workshop at that time. But then there was that transitionary period later on when it moved to Brian Ansell in charge, and then the whole operation moved up to Nottingham from London. So what was it like during that era?
It was interesting. It was obviously different, like to where Games Workshop ended up. It was a company that was a lot smaller for a start. But that was quite a fraught time, to be perfectly honest, to be working there, because what happened was there was a big internal fight between kind of like the middle senior management. Under Ian and Steve were ready to move on and get out, basically. But it wasn't just a kind of like a given that Brian was going to take over. There was some management in London who were keen to try and take the company over and take it in a completely different direction. And so it created this kind of like weird set of office politics at the time, which wasn't terribly much fun to be right in the middle of. And in the end, Brian came out on top, and lots of stuff moved up to Nottingham. So most of the operation moved up to Nottingham, and I think I was just very lucky because I'd been working in London. I was part of the London Games Workshop operation, and the Nottingham Citadel team were going to be taking over. But I'd been up to Nottingham a few times to help the Citadel team at their open days. They used to have open days at the factory in Eastwood, where people could come along and like go into the factory and play games. And I remember they had a thing where they had a sweet jar, the old-fashioned sweet jars that you get that filled with metal miniatures, and you had to guess how many miniatures were in it. And the person who got the closest got the whole jar of miniatures to take home with them. They did things like that. But they wanted to have a game stand there as well. And at that time, what happened was Games Workshop in London sold all of the board games and White Dwarf magazine and all of those kinds of things, and Citadel sold the miniatures. So I came up with a stall of the board games, and I got to know everybody and go out to the pub and go to parties and things like that. So when I moved up, I was accepted as being okay, basically, and I knew a few people already. So I was one of a handful of people that stayed on after that move. Most people ended up going back down to London, but I stayed in Nottingham and was accepted, more or less, by the Citadel crew. It was as a weird southerner, but an okay chap, basically, and kind of went on from there. Yeah. But it was a strange time, and I think that it was good once it had finally settled down and Brian had properly taken over, just because it meant that the company had direction it was going in, and it was there wasn't all of this, like I say, strange office politics involved that you tended to get caught slightly in the middle of between different factions.
So then that Citadel, the sort of internal takeover almost, I guess, with Brian Ansell's then direction for the company and sort of move towards miniatures and all that sort of stuff. I mean, what did that feel like from inside, as well as the company sort of really honed in on a particular area of gaming?
Well, it took quite a long time. I think we were young at that time. I think it's important to remember. We were about mid-20s, mid-late 20s. And so it took a few years to go from like Brian taking over to Games Workshop becoming the modern version of Games Workshop. Say 5 years, maybe a little bit longer. And that's a long time when you're in your 20s. So it didn't seem quick. It seemed evolutionary, and we slowly went in that direction. So there was more emphasis on the miniatures, but we'd been selling Warhammer for while I was still down in London for quite a while. Citadel had been very successful, and when I came up, basically I worked in trade sales, and I ended up moving over to the design studio because I came up with the idea for Blood Bowl when I was trade sales, and then moved over to join the design team. When I did that, I was basically the board games guy. I was brought in as the board games guy because I was from Games Workshop down in London, and I understood about board games. They knew I loved board games, and I did. So things like Blood Royale, Chainsaw Warrior, lots and lots of things like Botmania, actually, and things like that. Rogue Trooper. All of those things were kind of my little department to try and do things with. So, and that slowly over time came down. But when I was starting, we would just commission. People would write in. I can remember Steve Hand kind of like basically getting in touch with about Chainsaw Warrior in the post. He sent some letters in. Oh, this looks cool. So I got in touch with him, and we went and did the game, but we weren't looking for things that were specifically tied to the Warhammer IP at that time. And then slowly we focused more and more on that. And I think that the real, like that kind of like watershed moment was when the 4th edition Warhammer box set came out with all of the miniatures in the box, all the rules that you needed and things like that. And that was really, okay. Those old things then really just went away. They weren't there anymore, and we focused fully on our own background, and everything started to tie into that.
Did that? I mean, the 4th edition box. It seemed like a very intentional. It's almost a reboot of Warhammer in its entirety, but obviously a change to the actual business model for Warhammer as well. So, were you guys anticipating that sea change that would come from it?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's important to understand that at the time, I've never actually really have been senior management at Games Workshop. So I was more in the front line, like designing games and doing things, being given a brief and stuff. But I think the other important thing about the 4th edition Warhammer is that's the start of the Tom Kirby era. Now, Brian had a different view about the way that he wanted the company to go and evolve, and I don't think that he particularly saw it as being just totally focused on Warhammer, and then later on, like 40k basically, 28 mil scale stuff. He liked there to be a variety of different things, and was quite happy for there to be stuff that wasn't tied in directly with the core IP. So I think that what Tom wanted to do was kind of like make the business more scalable and more focused on on its strengths of manufacturing and stuff like that. And so when Brian left and Tom took over, he created a management team that included Rick and Alan Merritt and various other people. And what they did was, have a good hard think about how they were going to make Warhammer the game, and 40k the game, like dominant, very accessible, something that people could go into a toy shop and buy and start playing. And that's where the 4th edition box sets came out. So that kind of comes slightly after Brian, and as a result of that rather more kind of like trying to be more professional. I have to say trying, because actually, I mean, we were still very young. So a lot of it was rather hit and miss at that time.
Sure. I mean, you mentioned that you moved across into the design studio with Blood Bowl, and that was the first game that you were designing for Games Workshop. Could you talk a little bit about that process and then the design of Blood Bowl?
Yes. Well, I think so. When I came up with I came up with the idea. Well, I was in trade sales at the time, and again, there was a split. So I was looking after the books and publications that we made, and John Stallard, who runs Warlord Games now, was the lead trade sales guy for all of the miniature side of things. And I was talking to Brian, and I said, it would be cool if we had something in that we tended to do relatively large boxed games. Yes. So like Blood Royale and things like that, and Talismans. And I was saying it'd be useful if we had some little games, like 2 or 3 little games that were quick and easy to play. At that time, there were American companies like Steve Jackson Games doing micro games, they tended to call them, which were cheap, cheerful little things that you could buy for around about $5, I think, at the time. And so that's what I had in my head, and I just reeled off 2 or 3 ideas, one of which was, because I was obsessed with American football at the time. It was being shown on Channel 4, so I watched it quite a lot and really liked American football. And I said, you could do something a bit like American football, but except it's like, like it's orcs playing against, like goblins or something like that. And I went, ooh, I like the idea of that. You better go away and design it, Jervis. And I was like, I hadn't really thought that I was going to design it. I just assumed that you'd tell Hal or Rick to do it, basically. He said, no, you've got to go and do it yourself. So I kind of, okay. I remember going home to my flat and kind of like thinking, what do I do? And because I've been playing games for a long time, and actually I had designed games for myself. We've been joined by, sorry, the cat.
This is Martha coming to get involved. She's a big Blood Bowl fan, so she wants to hear it.
So I started, I'd done a little bit of games design, but nothing which I'd consider professional. So this was a big kind of, like leap into the dark for me. And so I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll base it a bit on Warhammer, because we've got the mechanics there, and Warhammer's popular, but on a board. So I came up with the idea of the board. And if you look at first edition Blood Bowl, that's pretty much what it is. It's a Warhammer skirmish played on a board with a square grid. There happens to be a small innocent football that kind of like occasionally gets picked up, but most of the time people are just hitting each other and things. But then I got really lucky, because I came up with that, and I'd written the initial stuff down, and I'd put some humour in. But then I got hooked up with Ali Morrison and Mark Gascoigne. Ali Morrison came up with the artwork and the look, and Mark Gascoigne did a huge amount of really important work in terms of developing up the background. He came up with the idea of Jim and Bob for the examples. And as a little team, we worked together. It worked together really well. And now looking back from where I am now, I know that games design is not a singular process. There can be a name on a box, but actually it's much more like being involved in making a movie or something like that. It's a team of people with different skills. And what makes it work well is luck and that combination of different things, and everybody then sparking off of each other and kind of like raising it up. So one person will have an idea, and then somebody else will run with that ball a bit, appropriately enough for Blood Bowl, I suppose. But between the 3 of us, we created this thing which was rather cool. It looked cool, it was fun. And the game at least could be played. I look back at first edition Blood Bowl, and you can see that I really wasn't a really experienced games designer. But it was good enough. And I can remember it coming out, and the first letter appeared on my desk. So this was my first experience of that kind of like, it's scary when you create stuff, because you're out there. There's nothing to hide behind. You made it. I thought, okay, they're on to me now. They're going to say this game simply doesn't work, Mr. Johnson. How dare you put out such a pile of tosh? But it wasn't like that at all. It was just like, oh, I love this game. And it was a fan letter. They said, the first one I'd ever received. And I thought, oh, thank God for that, basically. But it just proved really popular. It sold very well. And then so Brian said, okay, we've got to rush out an expansion for it. So we did the first expansion, Death Zone, which I think came out like really quickly after. It shows how different things were then. Because we could sort of like say, okay, let's go, let's make an expansion for this game and get it out sort of like in a few months, basically. Now it would take a few years.
Sure.
And then it kind of went on from there, really. So I got to do some other things, because I got moved over. I was running the board games thing, but then I got basically kind of like got promoted up to becoming a games designer and working on other games. We did the second edition of Blood Bowl, which has the famous polystyrene pitch, which was cool. Though that caused a lot of trouble, because basically the machines that made them were designed for making polystyrene packing materials. And with polystyrene packing, it doesn't matter if you dent the corner of it and things like that. So it tended to spit these things out very quickly. So we've got a lot of wastage, basically, on those Blood Bowl pitches, because the machines weren't really designed for something to go in a game, which is why we didn't do them again. However cool they may have been, losing a third or whatever it was as wastage just wasn't really sustainable. And I kept on going along, but then for me, the third edition of Blood Bowl, the one that came out in 1993, I want to say, I think that's the right year, round about that anyway, was where I transitioned from being somebody who was like almost an amateur games designer. I was nicking ideas from other players, copying. I was copying other people's stuff and like smudging them together to make a game. Because I played loads of games, so I knew what I liked in a game, and then I'd nick ideas and, like I say, push them together. But with Blood Bowl 3rd edition, I didn't stop doing that. But what I did was I used them for my own purposes, and it's the first time where I knew what I wanted to achieve when I went into the process. I knew what the problem with the game was, and in particular, in Blood Bowl 1st and 2nd edition, as I say, they were based on Warhammer, so you tended to get like a ruck. As the two lines met in the middle, and they just hit each other a lot. So it was like a little battle would break out in the middle of the board, and then somebody would stagger out holding the football, and then people left standing to chase them down. It was boring, basically. It was just lots of dice rolling up and down the line, and I knew that I didn't want it to be like that. I didn't want, and I also wanted there to be like two halves and things like that. So I got all of these things that I wanted to do, and I came up with solutions for the idea. So the big one for Blood Bowl 3rd edition was the idea of the turnover, which was a real eureka moment in terms of games design, because basically what it does in the game is it forces you to do the interesting stuff first. If you just kind of like just bash people up and down the line, then what will happen is a turnover will probably take place, your turn will end, and you won't have got anything done at all. And creates tension, pulls the other player into the game, because they're watching every dice roll to see whether you fail, and then they can take over. And it also happens to be a term in American football as well, which was just really sweet, I thought. So it was, it was a very satisfying thing to do. And for me, that kind of like coming up with that little process was where I thought, actually, I can do this. I am actually a games designer now. And I think and then again, I was lucky. I was working with a great team of people. With 3rd edition, the studio was based on low pavement, and we had a cool building that we were all in, but it was separated from all of the rest of the games workshop. So all of the studio staff, 40 of us, and so were there, and we set up a Blood Bowl league. And it was being played at lunchtimes and in the evenings, because it was very good for that kind of stuff. And so we got this amazing kind of like everybody was involved, everybody helped out. And it just came through, I think, in the game. So for me, I've designed other games which I think are pretty good, but I've got a feeling that Blood Bowl will be the thing where if I had to pick one, I'd say, well, that's where I can say I did good. That's a good game. And I'm really proud of it. And then I don't think it really needed to change after that. I think I might be anticipating a question here, sorry. I've never really, there are bits and pieces about it that I can tinker with, but actually the game then became its final form. I think aficionados will kind of like say, well, this changed slightly over the 20 odd years since that game came out. Bits and pieces of it have changed and modified slightly, but effectively it's the same game. Whereas 1st and 2nd edition were both completely different to each other and both completely different to 3rd edition.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that sparks a sort of thought as well around almost the pursuit of perfection when it comes to games design and subsequent editions, because it seems like you're not often able to find a version of a game, an edition, that does almost, quote unquote, perfect it and then leave it at that. And sort of, there always seems to be a need to iterate. I mean, did you ever find that sort of just generally was a challenge?
Yes, well, I think that, first of all, it's important to say that games design is an iterative process. That what you do is you go round and round and round. The more times you can go round, the better the game will be in general. and that's why deadlines are so important. Because I mean, like otherwise, you just keep on going forever, basically. Yeah, because you never do achieve perfection. And I think all creative processes are a bit like that. You know, if you've got in your head this idea of what it's going to be like, but you can never quite get it to it. So you keep on trying again and again. And so there'll always be something that you can tinkle with. And try to improve, because that's, as a creative person who's making those things, that's in your nature. And I think that it's interesting because what it does is it tends to create a bit of tension between the people who love the game, you know, and the people who make it. They've got different drivers. You know, I think a lot of people they'll pick up a game. So I think you can see it quite clearly with Warhammer and Oldhammer in particular. There are people who love and will argue with each other quite a lot about, you know, like, well, 4th edition, clearly the epitome of Warhammer, it should never have been changed. No, I think you'll find that 6th edition, I beg to differ. 3rd edition is where it's, so it's kind of like, you get these things, but quite often that's when people get involved in the hobby and they've got that thing and they love it. Now, when you're making the game, what you tend to see is just the things that could be a little bit better. And it's in your nature to make things and keep on making them, so you don't stop. And so there's a drive there to do new editions of the game. And then that gets reinforced and fed because you get a lot of feedback about the game. What people tend to feedback about a game is the bits that don't work. That they're not satisfied with. So you don't get very much of it's absolutely perfect, please don't tinker with it. That's not generally what people say to you if you're a games designer. What they'll say is, well, orcs are bloody rubbish in this version of the game. It's completely unfair, and it's because of this. And you think, maybe, like maybe we could have done that a bit better. Magic's too powerful. It's not powerful enough. Monsters are too good. Monsters aren't good enough, or whatever it might be. So so that reinforces your nature to want to make things, and you'll think, right, okay, we need to do a new edition, and then that gets further reinforced by the business wants new editions of games. They want to be able to say, and this is the best version ever because it's different to the last one. So you'll get pressure from marketing and sales to kind of like come up with USPs, something that they can say that says to people, you can't live with your old version of the game. What you really have to have is this new version of the game. But as the designer, that's not particularly your driver, if you see what I mean. It's just a little bit of pressure that you're under. And sometimes it can lead to kind of like, no, we need you to come up with things. And you're going, well, I really don't think that there's terribly much to do with it. And they say, no, we really want this new thing. So you have to go off and scratch your head and try and come up with something that kind of like makes the game that is a bit different to what came before. And I think particularly the end of the process. If I look at 3rd edition Age of Sigmar, there's lots of stuff I'm really proud of with 3rd edition Age of Sigmar. I think it's one of the best things that, in terms of writing a rule book that was coherent and like didn't have lots of mistakes in it and things like that. And it was brilliant. But I should have pushed back harder against the desire for there to be some extra bells and whistles added to the game, so that it would be easy to say, but here are these new things that you can do. Because just saying to people, we've written the rule book really well this time around doesn't really fit. Yeah, like for your sales guys, that's kind of, well, I don't know. Well, we can say that, but that's not terribly exciting, basically. So they'd want something a little bit more than that. And so there are elements in the 3rd edition of the game which really, I think, just clogged things up a little bit. And slowed down the gameplay, and you can often get things like that. And then what will happen is when the next edition comes around, because it will, you'll find that those things get taken out and replaced with something else. I mean, hopefully the team who were working on 4th edition Age of Sigmar or have, I finished it, were better at me than resisting that pressure.
Maybe one of the sales pitches becomes, we've removed all the bells and whistles. And
that's right. Absolutely. Yeah. Smooth gaming experience with the rulebook was perfectly read.
I was curious about, so in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a relationship between Games Workshop and MB Games. So that was when Space Crusade and Heroquest were made. I was just curious about that little period in time, because during that, you supported some of the development of Heroquest and also developed Advanced Heroquest. And I was just curious about sort of how that parallel work took place.
Yes, yeah, that was it was an interesting thing. I mean, basically, it was Milton Bradley, I think, at the time, rather than Hasbro, wasn't it? But they got in touch because they with Citadel, because they wanted some cool plastic miniatures. I think that's what they were really interested in. And I wasn't involved in the process, but Brian was able to come up with a deal where we'd provide them with miniatures for a game, like a fantasy game, a bit like D&D. And we'd be allowed, and they'd say that they were Citadel miniatures. They'd include that kind of like crossover and mention Games Workshop and say you can find out more about these things here. And we'd be allowed to do an advanced version of the game. And so the benefit there, and it worked really well actually as well, I have to say, was that Milton Bradley, Hasbro had fantastic distribution, and would get these things all over the place in quantities that Games Workshop at that time couldn't dream of producing. And they effectively acted as free adverts for Citadel miniatures. And then people would come to Games Workshops, would try and find out these other things. And then there'd be Advanced Heroquest and Advanced Space Crusade would be an obvious sell for people like those who went into a Games Workshop store, but they might just be coming in to look at Warhammer and things like that as well. So that was really the idea there. It was proper marketing stuff actually, again, talking about. It was a clever idea, I think, and worked out very well. And we had a little bit of connection on the games design side, the games designers, with the Milton Bradley games design team. I forget the name of the chap now, which is really bad of me. It's lovely.
It's Stephen Baker.
Yes, yeah, Stephen. Yeah, that wonderful chap, very talented. He just did a go, and I think we might have done a little bit of play testing, but really nothing terribly much. The main contribution from their point of view was the miniatures that we were making, which is obviously not something that I was directly involved with. Then once that game had been sorted out, I did become directly involved because we needed to do the advanced version of the game to make that kind of like that clever plan kind of like work. So I was asked to do Advanced Heroquest, and I don't remember. I think I might have had to start it before I'd even seen the finished version of Heroquest. So I don't think there's a lot of similarities between the two, other than that they're effectively a dungeon crawl game. Now, back then there weren't. I mean, these were pretty much the first dungeon crawl games. I mean, it's a whole genre now. I mean, I've designed quite a few of them over the years. But HeroQuest was the first one. And so what I drew on was my experience of playing Dungeons and Dragons, and in particular, my experience of playing Dungeons and Dragons with a chap called Albie Fiore. Albie, just one of the nicest, most talented people. He was, when I joined Games Workshop, he was the editor of White Dwarf magazine and the chief kind of like, he did all of the artwork and graphic design for all the stuff. So dungeon floor plans were created by Albie, if you remember those from back in the day, and all of the graphics design for all of those board games that were done by Games Workshop before it moved up to Nottingham. So he knew Ian and Steve really well, and I'd got to know him first when I worked at Game Centre, the store that I mentioned earlier on, because he was the editor of Games and Puzzles magazine then. But he was also just the most fantastic dungeon master. And if you manage to get your hands on things like there's early White Dwarfs, but I think some of the best of White Dwarf scenarios and things like that. There's some of his stuff in there. And he was just brilliant. I played in his dungeon. So a little while ago, some thing the TV show turned up where Ian and Steve got interviewed and they were playing Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm involved, and it's because that's Albie running the game, and they knew that I played in his dungeon, so I was there just kind of like making up the numbers and things. But what I did was I channeled Albie as much as I could into Heroquest, and the thing with Albie's dungeons were they were quite dangerous, and it was the economy. You know, you didn't have much money, you know, didn't find huge piles of loot, and you advanced quite slowly. And I think if you look at Heroquest with those things in mind, Advanced Heroquest, you'll see all of those in there. Yeah, so it's like it's difficult to survive, and you don't tend to come away rich. And so there was actually very little crossover with what Milton Bradley were doing. They'd got Heroquest is quite different, really, to that. And so really, the person who deserves the credit is Albie for all of the times that I crawled around his dungeon with Marcus, my fighter, and Rildo, the Hobbit thief. That's it.
Fantastic. And that was one of the early sort of big boxes. I mean, we talked about the 4th edition big box for Warhammer, but that was sort of one of them. And obviously there was also Adeptus Titanicus was one of the big boxes as well, Space Marine. Yeah. I mean, what was well, I suppose just thinking about those games, they've had an enormous legacy and gone on to spawn Epic and various other games as a result of that. When you were designing those games, did you sort of envisage where they would end up?
No, absolutely not. No. Okay, so we were young, and it was. It's difficult to describe, really. I mean, we knew the Games Workshop was what we were doing was cool. Basically, it was something that we loved ourselves. So there was a certain kind of when people ask me about it, I say. Back then, and still to this day, to be perfectly honest, Games Workshop combines this kind of like almost kind of like zealous kind of like crusading of this particular hobby that we love. Yeah, playing games with little toy soldiers on the tabletop, and board games and role playing games for that matter, with a good dollop of hard nosed commercial sense. So. And you need those two things together. You basically the commercial sense supported that ideological drive to want to kind of get people playing these games, get them out into as many hands as possible, so that people could have the fun that we had had. So I'm not sure if you're picking that up. You might get. I've got a nasty feeling that there might be some drilling going on somewhere. But if you do hear any noise,
I can't hear anything coming through. But I imagine it can be no worse than Martha's purring that's been coming in through this microphone here.
Okay, that's good. Sorry. And when I was growing up, I played quite a lot of games. They were called 1/300th micro armor games. So you've got little tiny World War II tanks, basically, that were around that epic scale, as we'd consider it now. But in my mind, they'll still be 1/300th scale, because that's they were 300 times smaller than a real tank would have been. Basically, I played quite a lot of those games, so I was a natural kind of like fit for Adeptus Titanicus and then Space Marine, and so that was after Blood Bowl. That was the first proper project I got when I was actually working in the studio. I was doing it during the day rather than like when I'd gone home over the weekend and stuff. I think the original game is okay. It's it hangs together okay, but I don't think we realised quite what it was that we were birthing, and in particular with Adeptus Titanicus, we had no idea that the Horus Heresy was going to kind of like become the big thing that it was, because the reason it was included in the game was that so Brian was keen to do a giant robots fighting each other game. He just loved the idea. He loved battle tech. And he loved that whole kind of like thing. So he wanted to have that set in the 40k universe. And Adeptus Titanicus was the game that was going to be it. But at that time, Workshop was small. plastic tooling was relatively expensive. We weren't expert at it, so we could only afford one tool to go in the game. So it was going to have to be like one time that you got it in the game. And we could repeat the frame multiple times because plastic was cheap, but we couldn't afford to make anything different. There was going to be one. So it was like, well, that means that both sides have to have exactly the same thing. The tool was designed so you could kind of put them together. It was a bit modular, so you could put them together slightly different, but basically it was so okay, we need some kind of like reason why these things are fighting each other. And we were looking through the Rogue Trader rulebook, and there's a box out in the Rogue Trader rulebook, which is sort of like something like Horus throwing the Emperor throwing the War Master Horus into the Eye of Terror by his heel. It's like a biblical kind of like quote, basically, which Rick had just made up just to kind of like, so because it just felt right. It was like kind of like got across that kind of like the huge long history and the fact that there were things early on in the history of 40k that had become legend, like the kind of stuff that you'd read about in the Bible. Well, all that could work. We'll use that then. Why don't we? But it was set 10,000 earlier. We knew that it had happened in the year 30. Well, we won't worry about that. We'll use that. And that was why we ended up using the Horus Heresy and why it was a civil war. And then it just kind of grew from there, basically. It just like, while we were working on it, it was cool. Then when Space Marine, so the Adeptus Titanicus came out. Actually, I think I might have one here. Just hold on just a moment. I'm going to disappear off camera slightly. So, the problem with Adeptus. So, first of all, let's see if I can hold this up. That is a 1/300 scale Sherman tank, basically. Right. It's still got in my collection. So that's kind of like, I was playing games with those. Now, we did Adeptus Titanicus, and the problem with the robots was that what they did was they looked like dreadnoughts because there was nothing to scale them in the game other than the pictures and the artwork on the box itself. Once you put the model down, if you put it next to a 40k model, it looked like a dreadnought. And so early on, we decided that what we needed to do was some vehicles. And the very first thing that happened, this is one of them, this is one of the metal rhinos that we had made. And the idea was that we could put these in photographs and it makes the Titan look big because it's by its foot is a little tiny rhino. And then we needed to write rules for those things. And then it kind of went on from there and became Space Marine. But actually, the genesis was giant robots fighting each other. Then you need, which meant that with a single frame, so it had to be a civil war, which created the Horus Heresy. And then we really needed to get something to scale the Titans so people could realize how big they were when they were playing their game. So we added in some rhinos and things like that, and so a few rules to do that, and then it just became its own thing from there, really, and created this effectively kind of like a 40k version of that type of game. And went on from there. But it was very an organic process, I think. Does that make sense? We were taking things that we knew about, that we enjoyed doing ourselves, or that we were passionate about in one way or another. And we said, well, other people probably enjoy this too. How can we get it out to as many people as possible and do it in a way that's going to generate enough money to pay all of our salaries and kind of like allow us to do more things like that and keep on doing that.
And
from there, really.
It almost feels like, and this seems to be a thing across a lot of GW over the years, it's almost necessity is the mother of invention. And then it's grabbing that and making the best of a decision that had to be made. So we had to do it this way. How can we then capitalize on that limitation? Yeah.
Well, I think that's, for me, that's the nature of the creative process. As a creative, when you're a professional creative, if that makes sense, where you're doing work for other people, if you can't learn to really enjoy the limitations and the problems that come up, you're in the wrong business because you're going to get very frustrated. The professionalism is kind of listening to what those things are and coming up with a good solution to the problems, as best you can. And that's also the fun of it. So I like it when. So after one of the things that Age of Sigmar first edition took quite a lot of flack for was that the rules were 4 pages long. Now that was something that was just handed down to me as the rules writer. Tom and Alan were very, very keen that the rules could just be given away as almost just like thrown in a box. You know, they weren't terribly important. Was the thing. The models were the important thing, and the rules were very short. Now that was a fantastic challenge, and actually forced me to be really quite creative in the decisions that I made. Now, I don't think we quite managed to pull it off, though there were some compromises made. And I think if my version of the 4-page rules would have been rather more kind of like rules manually than the ones that came out. And I think that what we did was we hand waved some things, just assumed that people would be able to figure out what to do for that first version. And that stayed with me. So when I left Games Workshop and retired, one of the first projects that I did was I do. The Valor and Fortitude rules, which I've done with Perry miniatures. They're historical miniatures rules, but the starting point for them was that I wanted to do a set of rules for Napoleonic war games that were 4 pages long. That was my restriction. Again, the rules had to fit on 4 pages, but I wasn't allowed to hand wave anything. They had to be a set of rules that were all there. Everything was there. And we managed to pull it off. Basically, I had to go down to 9.5 point in order to do it, but but basically, the rules are 4 pages long, and so and I think you can see that what's happened is over the years, you kind of actually start looking for. I don't with the Valor and Fortitude rules. I didn't have to write them in the first place, but I wanted that challenge was like, how do you do that? How can I achieve this in the best possible way? Is the fun of it for me? It's like a little puzzle that you're trying to solve, and it's very satisfying when it works out right, and can be very frustrating when you can't quite get it to work. But
Sure.
Is the bit of games design that I love.
I mean, did you find that changed? I mean, obviously there was a limitation imposed on you when it came to Age of Sigmar first edition, but given that Games Workshop had become so much more successful over the years, I mean, things like, okay, we can only afford 1 tool for this game, those kinds of limitations, I assume, had sort of relaxed a little bit towards the sort of end of your career, later in your career with GW. So did you find that the sort of culture around that games design, that's almost the limitations and the philosophy, did that change over time as the company changed?
Yeah, it definitely did. I think the main difference was that in the early days, there was a lot less supervision, put it like that. There was you tended to quite often just be working on your own, to be perfectly honest. And the deadlines were very tight, so there wasn't much chance for people to look at things. And certainly when Brian was running the company, he ring-fenced the studio and wanted to be the only person who wasn't actually directly involved in the studio who would have input into how the game was going to go and what it would look like and how the rules would work. Now, over time, the number of stakeholders, people who are involved in that process of deciding what's going to be in a game, what things does it need to have, has kind of grown. And I think that's understandable because for a lot of people, it's their success and the hitting their KPIs and things like that, which all were things that we didn't used to really have in the olden days. It was just, does Brian like it? It had to become something a bit more measurable, and does Brian like it because he doesn't work here anymore? And so you have different kind of things, and everybody has them. But they wanted input into the process. And that changed the way that things worked. And I think that for me, towards the end, the good stuff was still there, but you tended to have it takes a lot longer, and you have to go to a lot more meetings and try to explain why you're doing things the way you are, and be ready to kind of like to say, okay, that's not what you want. You're saying at the last minute here that you want something different. Okay, we'll go away and do that, basically. Where in the past, it would have been more the responsibility of laying with you more. I guess in a way, it's kind of like there was less responsibility for you. You can say, well, you told me to do it that way. I told you that it wasn't a good idea, and now let's see where we are. So you got that kind of benefit. Now, I think that the danger is when people are listening to this, I think, oh yeah, the suits took over. Yeah, in actual fact, Games Workshop, in my experience, has never really been very much like that. The people most of the people in the company are passionate about the games, and they have opinions about the way that these things should work. They're interested in the hobby and how to get it out there, and they're interested in making the company successful. So that kind of like that ideologically driven kind of like let's get as many people involved in the hobby as possible, and the hard-nosed business sense kind of like things are all kind of like there, and they have opinions about those. But it can get frustrating because, and the biggest problem that I ran into wasn't like people, bean counters kind of like saying, oh, no, that will cost you too much money or something like that. We've got to do this because our graph shows that we'll sell 3.6% extra if you do it. It's somebody coming along saying, Jervis, I've had this brilliant idea about how we can roll to hit modifiers and like the army lists and things. And you think, please just let me do the games designing bit. You do the kind of like the managing bit, because that tended to be the bit where people would interfere in a way that was potentially kind of like could get in the way of the game being as good as far as I was concerned it was going to be. So it changed definitely, and there was a lot of fun to be had in the early days in the way things go. But then, all of that being said, one of the best projects I've ever worked on was 3rd edition Age of Sigmar, where I was working with a great team of people again. I think that we were lucky in a way in that 40k is so much more popular than Age of Sigmar, because it meant that we ducked under the radar a little bit. And we were able to do a lot of really cool stuff. And for me, it was just like the old days, basically. I absolutely adored that project. And it was a great way to finish my time at Games Workshop, because it was almost circular, if that makes sense. There'd been some frustrating bits and times, so it couldn't possibly fail to be over almost 40 years. But Age of Sigmar 3 was a fantastic project to work on. Everybody did their bit.
Sure. Yeah, and I was curious about your perspective of the journey to Age of Sigmar, actually, just with because obviously you've been involved over the years in various ways with Warhammer Fantasy. There was the decision to end it, and we're going to create something brand new outside of the sort of rules writing for that first edition of Age of Sigmar. I mean, what was your sort of feelings and sort of perspective on that whole period?
I think it's interesting. It was, I think it was obvious for us who were working on Warhammer that something was going to have to change because its trajectory was down and 40Ks was up, basically, and it was going to become unsustainable in the end. And so we were looking at different things, but we hadn't anticipated quite that, like that kind of like, well, we'll just destroy everything and start again.
Right.
And then, and it was, again, as I say, although people think that I have a lot of control over what Games Workshop, or used to think that I had a lot of control over what Games Workshop would do, because I wrote Standard Bearer and wrote articles in the magazine, so I was kind of like a voice talking to them about this thing. Actually, I wasn't, at that senior level to make kind of like big decisions like that. So the decision to destroy the old world and then recreate it was made by Alan Merritt and Tom Kirby and that kind of a very senior level, and then presented to us almost as a fait accompli. So this is what's going to be happening. So we just kind of like got on with it, really. And I think that the main, I think we thought, well, that seems a bit drastic. So we did, like kind of like, so here are some alternatives, but no, that was the way it was going to be. It had already been decided. So as a professional graded person, again, you kind of like you start to go, okay, right, okay, what can we do here? How can we make this as good as possible? And at that time, basically, all I was focused on was getting the rules. How could I get the rules to fit onto 4 pages? Trying to get the game to work without points value. So that really, look, we tried as hard as possible to say that we didn't think it wouldn't work without points values. But it was one of the kind of like, it was the 4-page rules. The world's been blown up. And the way that we'd have this kind of almost like a setting as large as 40k, where we could just make new models in whenever we wanted to, was so set in stone that you couldn't really push back against those. You just had to kind of like try and do the best you could. So I look back on that, and where Age of Sigmar 3 was one of the nicest projects I've ever worked on. Age of Sigmar 1 was the most painful process that I've ever been involved with. Right. It was, you had very little control over actually what was going on. You've got these very, very strange briefs, and it wasn't a very coherent plan. I think it was one where you could kind of like, you say, I'm not sure if this is quite going to work. And then when the game came out, well, I think the good thing about it was that it showed a lot of that up. It kind of like said, well, okay, so because there was a philosophy behind Age of Sigmar, getting rid of the points values. I think the basic drive was that people are more interested in the miniatures, and sometimes the rules and army lists and points can get in the way of you just collecting the models that you want and then playing games with them. The ideal, this kind of like the hope is that people just buy whatever models they like and keep on buying as many models as they like, and then occasionally push them around and have some fun with them. And what you don't want is for somebody to say, well, I've got one of this thing, or I've got a 2,000 point army, now I'm going to stop. Now, I never really bought into that, because I think it kind of missed the way that people collect miniatures, which is that if you're going to collect miniatures, then you want to, you don't sort of say, oh, right, I've got enough now. I don't know what I've heard anybody ever really say. Yes, I've bought my last miniature because I've got enough. I've got, it just doesn't work that way. And actually that kind of structure and the points values and things like that actually help with collecting. They give you some guidance and some direction to go in, so it encourages collecting rather than the restricts it. And that a good game, well supported with like various different ways to play, and like a good organized play setup and things like that, can really help sell the miniatures rather than hinder them. And what Age of Sigmar 1 showed was that yes, the second theory is right. Like the idea that the game rules and points values stop you collecting miniatures is completely wrong. So you can really see it just changing very, very quickly. It was proved. It wasn't a theory. It was a theory. It was proved wrong. So quickly we were like, okay, games design team, you idiots, why didn't you put points values in? Often sort that out straight away. So we went out and we did that, and cool stuff started to come out of it. The 3 ways to play, which I think is, for later Games Workshop, one of the most important kind of evolutionary steps in the way that you look at a miniatures game and a set of rules. That you, instead of saying we're going to try and write one set of rules that does everything, you say we'll have what's core fundamental principles, but then actually you can explore these in these different ways, and they've each got their own sets of rules which are tailored for that style of play, rather than trying to, like be a master of everything and it not work. So a lot of good stuff came out of that, but actually the process of going through it was very painful and hard. I didn't enjoy that bit very much, but fortunately Age of Sigmar 2 and 3 came along after that, so it all worked out well in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and Age of Sigmar, I mean, you've mentioned that's one of your sort of your proudest moments, and Blood Bowl. I just wondered if there were any other sort of really proud moments from across your career that stay in the mind the most.
There are a few. I think that there are things where you learn stuff. I think it's learning things that is the important one, and so it means that the standout moments tend to be early in your career because after a while you get pretty much set in your ways. Then you're kind of like you think that you've learned everything that you can. I think that there was Blood Bowl, as I was explaining, where I feel like I got to be a games designer for a board game. The 40k second edition codex for Chaos Space Marines stands out for me. I love that book. It's one of my favourite codexes. And we learnt a lot doing that. And it was me and Andy in particular, so Andy Chambers, and working together on that project. And we sat down, we had a hard think about it, and came up with a plan, basically, and then went and pitched it to everybody, rather trepidatiously, I have to say, because up until then, mostly we'd been told what to do. So in this case, we were going to come along and say it, and pitched it, and it was just like, yeah, brilliant, let's do that then, basically. So we just got away to go away and do it. And so there's a lot I like about that book. I think it's got a good mix of it's gamey, you've got your points, values, and your army list, but there's a lot of hobby that's kind of like and kind of like an understanding of the way that people were playing the game and doing things. I like all of the extra bits and pieces at the back and the sub bits and things like that. I learned a lot about doing army books and codexes from that, and it felt like actually, we can do this. We can do good stuff here, basically. Second edition Codex Chaos Space Marines. I think probably the other one that stands out quite a lot for me is Epic Armageddon, which I did when I was running Fanatic and the Specialist Games Division. And that was an interesting process because basically off of the back of... so I'd done Blood Bowl 3rd edition, and I thought, I'm a brilliant games designer, I've got this fantastic idea. So it pretty much epitomised in the idea of murder your darlings. So what I tried to do with Blood Bowl was cut out everything extraneous. It's easy to clutter a game up, so I just tried to focus in on that. And then we were going to do a new edition of Space Marine, basically. So I took what I'd learned there and put it into Epic 40,000. Now, Epic 40,000, I think, has got a lot going for it, but what it did was it abstracted things a lot. It's a very clean game system, and it's quite clever in lots of ways. But it does things like your tank is a Lehman Russ tank. It doesn't matter what you can see on the model in terms of the sponsons and things like that. It's just a Lehman Russ tank. So there's a lot of simplifications and things like that. People, on the whole, there are a few people who love it, and certainly within the studio, I mean, we all loved it. We had a great time playing it, and we loved the blast markers. There's lots of cool little good stuff about simulating kind of like combat, and that kind of scale in there. But it doesn't have much grit and kind of like, and it doesn't. What it didn't do was accept that if I'm somebody and I'm collecting like little tanks and things like that, the level of detail on the model needs to be reflected in the rules. So I think the easiest way of thinking about this is like, if you scale things up and down, the details in rules get more complicated. So in 40k, or particularly something like Inquisitor, you can see that somebody's... so in Inquisitor, you can see the different sorts of las pistol that somebody's got. Sure. So you're probably going to want different rules because they look different. But then in 40k, they become pretty much just a las pistol. In 40k, you can see whether a model's got hand grenades, so you really want to have rules for grenades. Get down to epic scale, you can't see the grenades anymore, or whether they're las pistols or anything, so you don't worry about that. But you can see that this Lehman Russ tank has got melter guns in the sponsons rather than las cannons or whatever it might be.
Sure.
So I learned that from Epic 40,000. I cocked it up. I made a bad mistake. It's probably the least successful game I ever designed in many ways in terms of its popularity. But with Epic Armageddon, I got the chance to kind of like make amends, basically. So what I tried to do was take the good mechanical systems like the blast markers and the speed of movement and the stuff from Epic 40,000, but marry that with a game that said, yeah, okay, this what you can see on that tank drives the like what it's armed with and the rules there, so it's got the right level of grid. And I worked hard on the rule book as well. That one it's a well-written rule book, and again, what it does is it's got cool stuff in the back. I really like the scenario section in it. It explains how to create your own scenarios very well, I think. And it's got good stuff at the back for retired models you can't buy anymore. There are rules for them in the rule book. So you could use stuff that was in your collection. And I think, I really liked that and learned a lot from it. So I found those to be high points. Those, along with Blood Bowl and Age of Sigmar 4.
Yeah. No, that's great. Yeah, and I suppose there must be, given there is so many different games you're involved with, I imagine there was lessons learned throughout and in so many different ways.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But, I was... and there's so many fun projects. I mean, because quite often, Necromunda was a fantastic project to work on, but I was very peripheral on that one. I was just doing really doing the campaign system for it pretty much. But it was just a joy to play test and be involved with, really. It was a great project to work on. But it was Andy and Rick who were really doing all of the heavy lifting there. So it was easy in that kind of way.
Mm.
There were the board games, so Battle for Armageddon, and I'm going to forget their names now. So it was a long time since I've looked at them. The Horus Heresy.
Yeah, Horus Heresy. Yeah,
those were interesting projects to work on, and I got to do some like proper board war games because I love my board war.
Yeah, I mean, Doom of the Eldar is a favourite. It's fantastic.
Yeah. And I really like it. It was my favourite out of the three, actually, in many ways, because I really like the idea of that, the big ship in the middle, and then you get the spaceship, so you kind of get naval battles and then sort of D-Day like landings going on and all that kind of stuff. But they were fun to work on, and so like so many different things for so many different reasons. There are quite a few.
Yeah, I'll bet. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned that you've done some work with the Perrys more recently. Is there anything else that you're working on now that you're sort of still putting together?
There is. Unfortunately, I can't talk about sort of a lot of this. So I've got a bit of freelance work, which is cool. And I've also got a couple of projects of my own that I tinker away with. So like Valor and Fortitude was a bit like that, and that's turned actually into kind of almost like a full-time job, really, I have to say, because there's a great community out there that keep coming up with questions and cool ideas and stuff and asking for new army lists. So and the Perrys, I'm meant to be doing army lists for all of the ranges that the Perrys do. So it's like, how do I get these rules to work for the Franco-Prussian War as well as the Napoleonic Wars and stuff like that? So there's quite a lot of work there. So some freelance work, which has been interesting to do. Because I've never been a freelancer before as such. I've always worked within the company. So it's been an experience. And Andy Chambers and various other people, Mark Latham, who lives in the same village as I do, have all been very helpful because they're experienced freelancers and kind of like sort of saying, well, you're out of the corporate world now, Jervis. It's a different kind of setup here. So that's been quite an experience, and I've enjoyed it. And then I've got, let's say, a couple of other things that I'd like to design. So I've silly things. I'm slightly obsessed with a battle in the First World War called Bloody April, which was an air combat fought in 1917 on the Western Front. And in the course of a month, the Royal Flying Corps, as it was called then, had a terrible time. The Red Baron, Baron von Richthofen, was at the height of his powers and shot down loads and loads of British aeroplanes. So it ended up being called Bloody April because so many British aeroplanes were shot. Life expectancy was about 2 weeks if you were a pilot. But you get huge numbers of aeroplanes and stuff. My grandfather was a rear gunner in a Bristol fighter, and so I've got a connection. So I've read quite a lot about it. I have become really quite expert actually on that. So I've got an idea for a game about Bloody April.
Right.
and some other things that I'd like to do when I get the chance. Really, I don't think I'm ever going to stop. It's just in my nature, really. It's
that's great. I mean, I'm very pleased to hear that there's plenty more Jervis Johnson games to come, because I mean, you've been responsible for so many amazing games that I've always loved. So I look forward to that.
Okay, that's good. Yeah,
but
it'll be fun.
Well, thank you so much, Jervis, for joining me, for finding the time and chatting to me. It's been a real delight. So yeah, thank you so much.
That's okay. No, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
I want to thank Jervis for taking the time to chat to me about such an incredible career at Games Workshop, and for creating all of those amazing games in the first place. It was a real joy to talk to him, and just amazing. So thank you, Jervis. If you want to support the work that I do here on the channel, my interviews and my history videos about the origins and evolutions of my favourite games, then you can consider checking out my Patreon via the link down in the description. I really appreciate any support that you can throw my way. It's the only way I'm able to keep doing this work. And if you can't, then liking and subscribing and commenting on the videos and subscribing to the channel is really helpful as well. I have now released a podcast feed of these interviews, which you can get in every major podcatcher, so go and check that out. They come out a little bit after the interviews are available on YouTube, but they're all going to be made available in time. Thank you once again to Jervis. Thank you for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.